folks. I'm Wilt, Brighton Town Board member and also Democratic 2020 candidate for Congress in New York's 25th Congressional District. I want to thank you for joining us today for another COVID-19 community check-in and update. Now, these are updates where we highlight the issues facing our frontline and our most vulnerable community members in order to raise awareness and hopefully build action around moving forward through this pandemic together with no one left behind. Today, we're going to focus on gun violence in the age of COVID-19. And I want to recognize both of our interpreters today, ASL interpreters. We have Don Zuppelli and Alicia Brandt. Now, June is Gun Violence Awareness Month. In some communities, gun violence is rare. And our interpreters today, can we have everyone mute? Thank you. So as I was saying, June is Gun Violence Awareness Month. In some communities, gun violence is a rare and alarming occurrence, but in others, it's just a fact of life. Now, the latter is a sad status quo faced by many American communities and neighborhoods. A study in Boston found that half of all gun violence was clustered in less than 3% of intersections and streets. In Washington, D.C., a small number of schools were within a few hundred feet of a disproportionate number of gunfire incidents. Who's most affected by gun violence? Well, that's young men, particularly young African Americans, disproportionately go to the hospital for gun violence assaults. But the concentration of violence is even more intimate than the broad demographics would suggest. In one African American community in Chicago, 41% of all homicides were concentrated in a social network consisting of less than 4% of the population. In the United States, we have gun violence problems that are distinguishable one from another. These are problems that include suicides, mass shootings, gun violence in an urban context, intimate partner violence, and other factors which need to be examined individually. Now, often when we discuss gun violence in this country, the collective mindset gravitates towards mass shootings. And I think that's because widespread calls to action to combat gun violence most often follow in the wake of mass shootings. While statistically speaking, gun deaths are more likely to occur by other means. This, of course, raises the questions of why the level of concern is heightened in the case of mass shootings and deaths, which tend to skew towards less diverse demographics versus urban gun violence, which disproportionately impacts our communities of color. Looking at the intersection of all gun violence problems in the United States, the only common denominator is access to firearms, which is why gun violence must be addressed as multiple unique issues. One of the major issues that researchers in the arena of gun violence face is inadequate funding. The United States federal government spends approximately $63 per life lost on gun violence research, according to a 2017 study. By comparison, motor vehicle research receives about $1,000 of federal funding per life lost, and the robustly funded HIV research receives over $180,000 per life lost. Now, this discrepancy can be partly attributed to the 1996 Dickey Amendment, which, in addition to cutting funding, ensured that, quote, none of the funds made available for injury prevention and control at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention may be used to advocate or promote gun control, unquote. However, after more than 20 years of minimal funding, the US is finally opening its purse strings to fund research on gun violence prevention. Congress allocated $25 million, not a big amount, in December 2019 to gain new insights into the ways that gun violence can be prevented, with funding split between the National Institutes of Health and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. A new November 2019 article in the Rochester Beacon noted that despite New York's relatively strong legal restrictions on gun ownership, sales, and transfers, illegal firearms continue to appear in Monroe County during criminal investigations and at crime scenes. From 2009 to 2018, RPD confiscated 4,466 so-called crime guns, firearms that were used in or connected to crimes. RPD investigated 1,837 shootings from 2009 to 2018, 223 of which were fatal. Now, add the illegal guns to the Monroe County Sheriff's Office, the county's 9 town and village departments, and the state police have collected over the years, and the total confiscated locally could be much, much higher. According to a 2016 report from the New York Attorney General, law enforcement agencies confiscated 4,536 crime guns in Monroe County from 2010 to 2015. Research by the Attorney General's office revealed that 74% of the 52,915 crime guns that law enforcement agencies recovered in the state from 2010 to 2015 traveled here from beyond its borders, well above the national average. Meanwhile, more than half, or 56% of the crime guns collected in Monroe County originated somewhere else in New York. Obviously, our blanket approach to gun violence is leaving certain communities at higher risk. Today, I'm joined by 2 community advocates, Anthony Hall of Book Bags Express and Justin Morris. And I'd like to welcome you both. First of all, I want to thank you for joining us in conversation today and give you both the opportunity to introduce yourselves in greater detail and tell us more about your community involvement. Can we start with you, Anthony?
Yes, how you doing today, Robin?
Good, thanks. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. So as you stated, my name is Anthony Hall. I'm in the community as a representative of Book Bags Express, which takes a deep dive in community issues by galvanizing the community to do community-led forums and community-led events. Some of the events that Book Bags Express hosts is Thanksgiving for the community, a large back-to-school event, and a multitude of other events in the community. Also, during this time, as we all know, George Floyd's death has ignited a spark in the Black community, a well-needed spark. And what we're seeing across the nation has impacted our community, and now it has touched Rochester. And here in Rochester locally, phenomenal groups are forming, and one of the groups that I have, along with a lot of community members, put together as a community task force to address disparities and racial injustices in this community by collabing. As I keep saying, and I will keep reiterating, the people bend the will of government, and until we unify under one common ground, which is racism, things won't change. But if we unify, it'll happen. It'll happen. So once again, thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for pointing out that common thread. White supremacy, racism, that is the original sin. You know, since 1619, our country has had a racial hierarchy, and it's something that we combat in all aspects of life. And so, you know, you point out gun violence is not just about, you know, one person on another. Sometimes it involves police. And those are also statistics that we do not track as well we should. And so welcome to the conversation. And Justin, would you mind introducing yourselves and tell us a little bit about your activism?
Hey, how you doing, Robin? As you said, I'm Justin Morris, founder of Untitled Ministries, an outreach organization here in the greater Rochester area. And our focus is centered around civic engagement and crisis response to different situations, mainly gun violence and the aftermath thereof, and different things pertaining to our community. I don't just limit myself to that. There's a blanket of issues that we respond to. I work in very close proximity with the brother Anthony Hall. You see me You see him, you see him, you see me. So we're together a lot, fighting together on the, sorry, my screen had went blank. I wouldn't even say on the front lines, in the mud with the people of our city to try to get some different outcomes as it relates to being under marginalized and underrepresented with all of these issues. I gotta plug my phone in, so I'm gonna bring my, what's it called, closer to the screen.
Oh, okay. No worries, no worries. And you talked about the intimacy that was alluded to in the introduction, Justin. You know, these are relationships that are affecting, gun violence are affecting, intimate portions of our community. And you are in the business of building those relationships and making sure that we advance through the trauma. So thank you so much for your work in that area. So let's get right into it here. In each of your experience, what does gun violence look like in our city? Why don't we start out with you first, Justin?
First thing I want to say is graphic. It's bloody, it's messy. Some of the things you see in regards to some of these situations, it never leaves you. It's traumatizing, unaddressed. In regards to the gun violence, once a shot rings out, there's a response that has to happen. And from that response, there's several different outcomes that take place. Someone shoots a gun, you either have somebody shot, you have a homicide, or you just have a shots fired. So in that process, when that situation occurs, everybody's emotions and senses are heightened, and it creates a traumatic situation. And I don't think oftentimes we understand how traumatic that is for the people that live in these neighborhoods, that live in these areas. As you stated earlier, a lot of times violence occurs in such a small radius. And for those people, it's just continued trauma after trauma after trauma after trauma, funeral after funeral after funeral after funeral. So you have a heightened sense of fear in this community, and different things of that nature.
Thank you. Yeah, you talk about the graphic nature of gun violence, and for a lot of people looking at the problem, it's anecdotal. It is not something that's within their scope of experience. So I thank you for really putting a face and a voice to those most impacted by these issues. So thank you for sharing. And I know that comes at emotional cost and burden. So I want to leave space to acknowledge that. And move on to you, Anthony.
Thank you. Yes, I echo Justin. It's definitely gruesome. But I have a different lived experience. Being a victim of gun violence, I was shot in 2013, breaking up a fight. And the anxiety after being shot, well, first being shot and I was a victim and being treated like a criminal. I was criminalized by law enforcement when they came on the scene. Even as I went to the hospital, I was treated like a criminal by hospital staff. It just threw me for a loop. Nevertheless, anxiety ended up happening. Being shot and hearing gunshots end up, just every time you just turning around. Particularly in our community, it has become a norm. if you hear a gunshot, the first thing most of us say in this community, oh, that was a firework. That was a firecracker, fireworks or something to that nature. And it was a gunshot. Or you'll hear a conversation, such and such got shot. We're so, we normalize it so much now that it's become part of our everyday experience. And it's not normal. It's not a battlefield. And, you know, we don't talk about it in the community enough because it is there's a huge trauma component connected to it. And, you know, being in them spaces in our community is hard for especially the Black community because we've been taught you don't talk about your feelings. You don't tell your feelings, and so on and so forth. So creating a new narrative to be able to have that dialogue and that conversation, particularly such as like this, times like this, is very important when you're talking about gun violence because the national talk about gun violence, to your point, Robin, is mass shootings. And when we go in places, for instance, Joe Morelli had a forum in Irondequoit, and they talked about, and it was gun violence, and he talked about, you know, eradicating some of the laws for gun violence, and you know, it's a double-edged sword because the violence he's talking about is mass shooting, and particularly, you know, that really affect our counterparts, white folks, and the violence we're talking about affects us Black folks, and there has to be a medium, and because we don't want it's already hard enough for us to obtain a gun, so some of the legislation that he's putting forth is going to make it 10 to 20 times harder for African Americans, people of color, to obtain a gun. So we have to look at that. So being knowledgeable of guns in our community, you know, being able to hunt and protect yourself, those are natural laws. That's important. So this forum is definitely important.
Yeah, you raise a number of important issues. Again, just referring to the fact that when we talk about gun violence, we often talk about it in terms of this monolithic issue, when really it is a number of issues that are intersecting. And, you know, New York State has some of the most restrictive gun laws in the country, yet we still have levels of gun violence that suggest that our restrictive gun laws are not working for everyone. They're not working to curb the violence in our communities. And we need to address that. And we need to make sure that we have evidence-based solutions to gun violence, as opposed to treating it as this blanket issue that affects every community in the same way. We really need to have an individualized legislative plan for gun violence that affects our communities. And that's something that I don't think we talk about often enough. And that's why I want to talk about today just what gun violence looks like for us, because I think that gun violence for a lot of other communities does not resonate the same way. People do not experience it the same way. So talking about solutions, let's first get down to the nitty gritty of what you view as the main causes of gun violence in our community. Shall we start with you, Anthony?
Definitely. You have to pardon me. I'm outside, so you might hear the
Yeah.
wind of some cars.
It's okay.
Because I'm still downtown. They're having a protest. Lawyers, the public defender's office is actually protesting for justice. So nevertheless, so one of the issues that that affect our community in gun violence, particularly that stands out, Mahatma Gandhi said that poverty is the worst kind of violence. And it's important that we understand why violence is so high among Black people. During this time, we've seen the conversation come up, had that same energy when Black on Black happened. Not just when a cop killed a Black person. And I think we have to understand that narrative on why we're reactionary in our own community with our own selves. So one, inadequate jobs. Minimum wage in New York State is up to $12, but in Rochester it's only 10, 15, I believe, and that's not a living wage in our community. And people, like I said, once again, anxiety. There's certain things that people need in this community, and they gonna get it. And it's a generational thing amongst our people. Disparities, and working for your whole life, and the outcome is really Social Security, really no pension, and then passing on and leaving bills behind. So poverty is one of the best indicators for me, for violence. Where you find poverty is where you find a high volume of Black on Black, Latino on Latino crimes. And don't get me wrong, our counterpart, white folks in their communities, there's large portions of crimes in their community pertaining to gun violence. So we can't shy away from that. But because we're so in proximity of each other, it's us. So poverty is definitely one. And how do we address poverty? Jobs, education, beautifying the community. People say, well, I'm renting, so why would I clean up outside? That's on the landlord. Or why would I sweep the street? Because no matter what, you still live on the street. And those individuals with a criminal mindset that feel like, yo, I'm gonna go on this street and do whatever. 9 times out of 10, because the street is clean and neighbors know each other and it's a communal thing, that changes for individuals with the criminal behavior mindset. And one of the biggest things that can help is love. Me and Biscuit Justin just got off the phone with a pastor, and I always talk about love. And the pastor said, Christ commands us to love, but it's on the human to like people. And that's deep, because you don't have to like somebody to love them. And I think extending love to the community at large is very powerful, and it impacts violence. In my work at Pathways of Peace as a gang specialist for over 7 years, I encountered so many brothers and sisters in the community that was impacted by violence. And yet, as they became on my caseload, I found out that they didn't have a loving environment. They were impoverished. Their family didn't know how to advocate. The system had beat them down so much that they just gave up and just turned to a criminal lifestyle. But through love, patience, and resources, and a communal effort, connected them to different people in the community, it changed the game, and it impacted some of those variables. But it's important that this thing is we understand that it's a marathon, not a sprint. So it doesn't happen overnight. And you got to meet people right where they're at. So it's important that us as a community know that and keep having conversation, dialogue on Facebook, Instagram, social media, whatever platform you have, whether you agree or disagree, is very important, because it pricks the consciousness. And that's what you want. You want people to be conscious, so that in order to get new legislative laws put forth, you not got to know who's running, who's in those seats. So that's important.
Yeah, absolutely. There is an educational component, and definitely a civic educational component. And I love that you did talk about love, because justice is what love looks like in public. And we do not have enough justice within our communities. What we see around us is the evidence of injustice and legacies of generational theft of wealth, that are written large upon our communities. And these are some of the issues that we need to address in order to address the issue of gun violence. You're absolutely correct. And I'll pose the same question to you, Justin. What do you see as the main causes of gun violence in our community?
Again, I'm going to echo a lot of what he said, but I'm going to kind of put it in a different light. One of my many professions is being a chef, right? And when you're a chef, one of the most complex dishes to make is a soup, because you got to have all the right recipe, all the right ingredients, and everything has to be just right. And I think right here in Rochester, the pot of soup that we're preparing, we have all the right ingredients to breed an atmosphere where gun violence is the norm. We have failing schools. We have a failing city. We are the second worst congressional district in the entire United States. We rank in the top 10 of poverty year in and year out, of childhood poverty. And when you look at the demographics of those who are committing these crimes in the community, overwhelmingly it's the young people in the community. So when you got a pot of soup cooking on the stove such as that, the recipe is perfect and the outcome is going to be just what it is when you put all of those things into this pot. Like Anthony said, there's so many different factors that play into this scenario that we see in our community. And it's unfortunate because you have so many different people trying different methods of combating the issue instead of really tying into the community and getting an understanding of what the people really need and what can suffice gun violence in urban environments. Not just here, but in Rochester as a whole. You got people in Albany fighting for legislation that's not necessarily going to work for the people in these communities that's faced with gun violence.
You mentioned something that's so critical to this discussion, basically evidence-based solutions. And I think whether we have evidence-based solution strongly ties into who we have around the table talking about the policy that we implement. And so often we hold these discussions in a vacuum from the communities that they most affect. And also you talked about systems, and gun violence is a systemic problem. But there are ways that we can individually address the root causes of gun violence, which I think both of you, through your organizations, have sought to implement. So if somebody's listening today, what are some of the ways that we can individually address some of the root causes of gun violence in our communities?
So
go ahead.
That's a great question. Justin always talking about food, so so what I believe is wholeheartedly the community, and one of the things that individuals can do first is check themselves, particularly because when we get to the root of the issue of why someone got shot or murdered, it's always over nothing. Almost always over nothing. It's a communication gap, and in our community, the lack thereof, we really don't like using our words in our community. And to my earlier point, when I said that we don't talk about feelings, that's important that we drive that at home. If you have children, you should be asking your children, well, what's going on? And don't let your child say, oh, nothing, I'm fine, and go in their room. Even if nothing's going on, ask them how they day doing. Allow them to express themselves in order just to vent. We don't have no venting mechanism in our community. As you've seen this past weekend, the only venting mechanism in our community is liquor stores. It's liquor stores on almost every corner in our community, and it wasn't closed during the pandemic. So we were hitting up the liquor stores My apologies. We were hitting up the liquor stores, and though that was our Vinny mechanism, or any other recreation, pharmaceutical, we indulge in. Those are recreation, but we have to be able to use our words and communicate with each other, be very transparent with each other. Even if, like I said, everybody think me and Justin are in the echo chamber. Me, whatever you say, I go with. Whatever I say, he go with. Absolutely not. We go at it. We debate. We argue. We stop talking for a little while to each other. All that. But at the end of the day, we come back together and say, "Yo, I love you, bro. This is what it is. I see your point. I see my point. We're gonna work together." And that's what it's about in the community. So starting at home, having those conversations at home, being prepared, because it's a real thing. Then as you start at home, it overflows into the community. So in the community, it's the community job, civic leaders in the community, to step up and create platforms for individuals and community folks to come out and talk about these things, talk about their experience. The meeting I called on Monday for community people to come out, and we had about 60 people come out, and it was just a debrief, allow people to vent on what took place on Saturday, as well as prior to Saturday, George Floyd's death and any other death that they wanted to talk about and how it impacted them. I think that's very important and therapeutic. So having that discussion at a community at large, and then taking that discussion to the next level to elected officials. These are the people that knocked on your door and ask for your signature. These are the people that you send mailers to. These are the people that you made promises to. These are the people that you told them that they can count on you. So now it's very important that you take whatever you got out of the communal gathering, and it's action items. You take them to the elected officials, and then the elected officials hear you out. And now it's on them to make a change at that level. And it's on the community to keep holding them accountable, keep pressing them. And it's a beautiful thing. That's democracy. It's a beautiful thing. But, what we find is that doesn't happen a lot. And unfortunately, that's where the struggle lies. The community is in disarray because at home is at disarray. The community at large, as Justin pointed out, a school district that's failing, a city that's failing, and that makes the best recipe for chaos. So a prime example, and I'll digress after this, but a prime example was certain communities across the nation. The law enforcement agency in that community joined with the protesters, locked arm in arms, and you haven't heard about rioting and looting in those communities. Because that's a proactive measure. The community has to be proactive. Law enforcement has to be proactive. Leaders have to be proactive. You know what I mean? And in our community, we have some phenomenal groups that are reactionary to gun violence. And those groups, it's not their fault, but that's the way the system is made up in this community, to be reactionary. The preventative work has been taken off the table. And I want you to respond to a shooting or respond to a homicide. But by that time, it's too late to have a conversation. Like, yo, why y'all beefing? Let's figure this out. So, the other point is being preventative. The schools have to take on a lot of responsibilities, and we have to support schools to be preventative, and recreation centers to be preventative, and families to be preventative, and set them up with resources that know how to talk their language, meeting people right where they're at. I'm not reading something out of a book or a clinician book or a social worker standpoint. No, I'm a human being. And a lot of these issues in our community, whether it's racism, violence, we have to take from a humanistic standpoint. Yes, it's impacting Black and brown people, particularly Black folks, more than any other ethnicity. But however, it's a humanistic lens that we all have to look through in order to combat and uproot this element in our community.
That's so deep, Anthony, because we're talking about, in this case, the social predeterminants of health and of violence, because if we look out our doors and all we see is devalued human life, then why would we engage one another with a humanistic attitude? And so what you say is very poignant. Thank you for making that point. And Justin, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, he kind of covered it, but I think one of the what's vitally important is for people to know that this isn't everyone's life work to end gun violence. But for the people who have that calling and have been called to do so, I think that it's very vitally important for, if you see something, say something. That doesn't necessarily mean, oh, I'm going to the cops on you, but build relationships with the individuals in the community who you know to be players in that lane, and have that influence to where, okay, it might be one kid this year that I can talk to, and I can get them to change their path of destruction or their path of violence. I think that is very important that we understand that we can't save everybody. We're not gonna save everybody, but there's key people in places, in positions that have influence over people who are in that vein that you absolutely have influence over. I know me and Anthony, just last year, Anthony, Quinn Smith, and I think another brother, there was a shootout with some young people on Hudson Avenue, and everybody ran and ducked and took cover, but it was second nature for us to step right in the middle of the shootout and diffuse the situation. You're talking about a real actual shootout, guns, bullets, people shooting at each other. And I think if you're not willing to do this work at that level, then you shouldn't be doing this work. This mission is a mission that may cost you a few things, and your life being one of them. So I think that the call to action in this vein, you really, really, really have to have not only a vested interest, but a passion for the work and for your community to talk about ending gun violence. And if that's not your passion, then there's another side to this. We have to attack it from policy. We can't continue to move forward in this community and certain people be off limits of persecution, of criticism, of ridicule, of different things of that nature, because what you'll begin to see happen is year after year after year, it's okay because X, Y, and Z holds X, Y, and Z seat. We as the people, especially Black and brown, I said it on Evan Dawson the other day, if it's not working, we got to get it out of here, because there's some people in this community that have innovative ideas that don't have a seat at the table. There's a reason why certain people aren't going to share a platform with me and Anthony. There's a reason why we're not going to be invited to certain meetings, because there are people who want to be accredited in this community with having the solution. And the sad part about it, that is one person in this community is not going to have the solution. You need a collective, but a part of that collective is, like I said earlier, taking the people that are in the mud, in the trenches with these young men, with these young women, and bringing them to the table and really, really putting the resources behind those individuals to make a change in this community. And then we attack it on a policy level.
I love everything that you said. And one of the points that you make in particular, you talk about flipping the script on that. If you see something, say something, where usually we talk about it in terms of reporting criminality, reporting, suspect behavior, but instead using that to make sure that we're taking care of everybody in our community. If we see something that is not right that's happening in our community, if we see somebody that's not being cared for in our community, it is our collective responsibility to embrace that individual and make sure that they're okay. And that is really the type of community building that both of you are engaged in on a very
Can I,
intimate level. And I
can I
think that's what can have a big impact. Go ahead,
can
Anthony.
I interject on you? So also just to elaborate for those that's watching on Facebook, when Justin is talking about when you see something, say something, that's not snitching.
Right.
So there's this notion in this Black community that when you tell, or and you don't have to tell the police, when you tell somebody else and it gets rectified, you snitch. So when you see something, say something, does not mean you're snitching. So snitching is when me and Justin robs a bank, and Justin gets caught by law enforcement, and he says, "All right, Anthony, we got caught." Only he got caught, not me. That's snitching.
Right.
But if you're on your porch and you see somebody running in somebody's house and and robbing their house, burglarizing their home, even if you don't want to go to the police, you could tell somebody in your community that you feel has credibility. It's very important that people establish those relationships in those positions as civic leaders in their own community. We have to get away from this notion that everybody in our community is a tough guy. All Black men are tough guys. All Black men carry guns. All Black men don't want to see change. We have to get that narrative out of our mindset, because that's not true. What I found through the last couple of weeks, how many people want to get involved. And I always say, the narrative that we were taught in order to speak out against certain things, you had to look, talk, and be educated and be from somewhere in order to speak out. And you don't. If you don't. If you want to speak out in your neighborhood, do it. No matter what somebody tell you, oh, you doing this, you can't do that. No one's perfect. So we're striving for perfection, as I say, and that is perfect. As long as you're striving and doing it, that makes you perfect. So it's very important that we understand the difference between the two.
Very good point. Very good point. And I hope that I was being clear when I said that. When I talk about flipping that narrative, I do mean like not talking about it in the traditional sense where we're talking about calling the police and criminal or suspect behavior, but rather it's to talk about it in the sense of building community. And so I absolutely agree with you 100%. I could go on for hours and hours probably with the two of you. You guys have a lot of really profound insights that I think people need to hear. And I hope that you will continue to have platforms to talk about these issues from the sense of your experience, from the sense of you being directly impacted by these issues. And again, like I said, those who are closest to the pain need to be closest to the solutions and crafting those solutions. So thank you so much for, again, being part of this dialogue. In conclusion, I want to talk about some of the economic costs of gun violence in our communities. Experts estimate that a single homicide can cost anywhere from $10 million to $19 million. That's one homicide. About 1/3 of those are direct costs. That's to the criminal justice system, the medical system, lost wages for the victim and the perpetrator. The remaining 2/3 of those costs, though, are indirect costs. They're associated with fear and avoidance triggered by homicide, everything from increased insurance premiums to suppressed property values and decreased economic activity. And we all pay those costs. While the impact of urban violence is felt most directly by a very small number of people, as we said before, we all are suffering from it indirectly. So let's say this. What if we gave cities an additional $30,000 a year for every homicide they saw in the previous year? And then put that money towards scaling up evidence-based violence prevention efforts, the type of relationship building that we're talking about with Anthony and Justin today. Now, to scale this up nationwide, including the 20 cities with the highest number of homicides and with the 20 with the highest per capita homicide rates, an investment of preventative efforts in these cities at the same funding level would cost only $900 million over 8 years, with the first year costing only $158 million. That's just a tiny fraction of our overall national budget, which is almost $4 trillion a year. So most importantly, that would be more than 12,000 homicides that were prevented. Again, at a cost of $10 million a year, or $10 million each. Just in terms of the financial cost of this country, that would be an estimated $120 billion saved. Gun violence imposes a vast array of socio-emotional and financial costs on some of America's most vulnerable communities. And understanding these overall costs is the first step towards addressing them. And community members who live with the daily presence of gun violence and its fallout, they must be at the forefront of addressing these critical issues. So again, I want to thank the two of you for joining me today, engaging in this very critical discussion. And again, I'll be out there with you, no justice, no peace. So thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Appreciate you.
Yeah.
Appreciate you for having us, Robin. Just got one request.
Yeah.
When you're on Congress, make us your experts on gun violence.
You know it. You know it.
All right. Thanks,
All right.
Robin.
Thanks for joining me.
All right.
Thank you for joining me.
Take care.
Both of you.
Thank you.
Take care. Take
Yeah.
care. Stay safe.
You too.